Morning, everyone, or should I say good afternoon, depending upon where you are. Thank you very much for joining us today at the Mupu Dig October meeting. Just a reminder that the next meeting will be on December 12th, at the same time, noon on Tuesday. But today I'm very excited to have Sarah Angel with us. And before I continue, just a reminder that we have a website that you can, or a community that you can attach yourself to. There's a link in the email that you received a week ago advising you of this meeting, and you can get notifications there if you sign up to the mailing list. Please do be sure to introduce yourselves in the chat. It's wonderful to know where everybody's coming from today. And I think if there's nothing else to be said, yes, please stay on mute. That's another important announcement to make. Then I will introduce our guest for today. Sarah Angel is the Executive Director, Founder, and Publisher of the Arts Canada Institute organization. And before returning to school in 2011 to pursue a PhD, Sarah had more than 15 years' experience as an arts journalist and publisher. From working as an editor at Phaidon Press in London to a stint as editorial director at Bruce Mau Design, Sarah was also an editor at Saturday Night Magazine and editor-in-chief at Chatelaine Magazine, and both of those are historical and profoundly respected periodicals in Canada. She was also a columnist for the National Post, which is one of Canada's national newspapers. But it was while teaching art history courses at the University of Toronto that Sarah realized that content about Canadian art and artists was virtually non-existent. And so, using funds she received as a recipient of the very prestigious Trudeau Scholarship, which is an award given to doctoral students who demonstrate innovative ideas that solve problems or issues of critical importance to Canadians, Sarah founded the not-for-profit Art Canada Institute, now known also as ACI, in 2013. Her vision was simple: to make Canada's visual culture, created by many diverse voices in both French and English, available to all Canadians and beyond the bricks and mortar of museums to the whole world. In a few short years, the ACI has published more than 60 online books about Canadian artists, about broad Canadian art movements, and about Canadian photography. It has indeed become a rigorous scholarly resource for academics, students, teachers, and the broader public. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sarah. I look forward to your talk.
Oh, thank you so much, Shelley, and thank you everybody for joining. It's really an honor to be here. I'm going to share my screen with you. I have some slides, and what I thought I would do is I would talk to you about the origin story of the Art Canada Institute, what it is, a bit about where we're going with it, and then I would love to hear questions from you. And so here is this was the very first screen that the Art Canada Institute had. We launched in November of 2013, so we are coming up to our 10-year anniversary. And when we launched, the focus was really about making Canadian art history a contemporary conversation. Even 10 years ago in Canada, there was a much more robust art publishing world, particularly around magazines and periodicals. There was a well-known magazine called Canadian Art Magazine. It now has folded, as I'm sure all of you on this Zoom call today know. Like publishing centers have diminished so much in terms of, and the landscape has changed profoundly. So when we started at the Art Canada Institute, we were really thinking about what we wanted to do was focus on art history, because that seemed to be the spot where things were missing. And the genesis, the real genesis, as Shelley said, was that I had, after a 15-year career in books, magazine publishing, graphic design, an industry that was definitely imploding by around 2005, I sort of thought, I am going to do the thing that I've always wanted to do, which is to do a PhD in art history. When I finished my undergraduate degree, I was always dissuaded from doing it. I was told, like, you will never be able to find a job. It's a terrible thing. Like, what can anybody do with an art history degree? And I don't know. By the time I was in my late 30s, I sort of knew I had already had a job. I was working successfully as a writer. So I did a PhD in the context that I think is the best way to do it, which is that I was really doing it because I was simply interested in doing a PhD. Incidentally, I did my PhD on Nazi era looted art, focusing around one Canadian art dealer, Max Stern, who was somebody who in 1937 was forced to sell his inventory in his Dusseldorf gallery by the Nazis. He restarted his life in Canada, and he became this great advocate of Canadian art. And so in many ways, it was a subject matter that many of my interests intersected: Canadian art, art restitution, art crime, etc. And once I was in I think it was my third year at U of T doing my PhD, I was started to be able to teach classes, and I was given big survey classes on the history of art. And so I began teaching those big survey classes. I began taking students to museums. And the reason I'm showing you this first slide here is because, I realized quite early on in my teaching career that the state of the museum today, with all due respect for those of you in this call, because I don't mean this 100% literally, but I do think more or less museums function much the way much the way they did in the 18th century. And as well, museums are far too undervisited, and there is much too much in storage. And and then I would go to the bookshelf at the University of Toronto at Robarts Library. I took this picture myself, and I would look for content on Canadian art history, and anything that I could find was woefully out of date. One of the best things about going back to university as a mature student was that I had a cohort of classmates who would say to me, like, why are you going to the library? It was like, why are you just not looking on your phone for information? And so another detail about myself is I have 3 teenage children who are at the time, very like toddlers. And I thought, I really want the situation to be that when they enter the words art into a search engine, that they are going to find Canadian art. And there was such a lack of it that existed, that I thought, okay, I'm going to do something where I change this picture that you're seeing on screen to this picture, right? Where we're seeing books on Canadian art that are available online. So Shelley mentioned that prior to starting a PhD, I had worked in art book publishing, traditional art book publishing at Phaidon Press in England. I'd worked with a graphic designer named Bruce Mao. I'd worked myself as a journalist and writer. So I knew a lot about how to kind of create content, both in print, less so in digitally, but I knew a lot about design. The other thing was that I, for about 10 to 15 years, had worked as what I would call a lay fundraiser. So in other words, I was somebody who, and I was involved in a number of different museums. And at one museum, somebody asked me to sell a bunch of tickets for an event. And I ended up being like the #1 ticket seller. So that started a sideline career that I had, where I once somebody knows you're good at fundraising, you become very, very popular. And I was very popular in terms of being asked to help out people. So I knew the museum model for sponsorship, and I thought, I'm going to apply that model to a not-for-profit organization that I'm going to create to promote Canadian art, history, and research. And the first thing that we would do is that we would create, hold on, I'm going to go back. That's the slide ahead. We're going to create a series of books on Canadian art and artists. And again, at first we were sort of focusing historically on it. What we decided is that we would do every book in a desktop version, a mobile version, a PDF version, and that we would do everything in both French and English, because in Canada, those are the 2 official languages. It's very hard to get taken seriously at a museum level unless you're publishing in French and English simultaneously. And the other thing that I decided is that we were going to make all of the content available for free. And so in that area, we sort of straddle both an academic model as well as a traditional trade book model. Because from an academic model, what we do is we're not offering traditional advances to the writers. We offer an honorarium, and we also offer that we do all image research, clearance, etc. So it's sort of a pretty good deal for the writers. And so in that way, we were able to manage our costs. The other thing that I was able to do from the get-go was I talked to many museum directors in Canada, and I said, this is what we want to do. And what we need you to do is we need you to waive your permission fees in order to allow us to use your work, from your museums without charging a permission fee. Now, interestingly, virtually every director that I spoke to, or actually all directors that I spoke to, they said yes. I don't really know if now in retrospect, I actually think they didn't really know what they were signing on for. They did it, and I think they just thought, like, this sounds really great what she's talking about, but who knows if it will ever come to fruition. So sure, we'll say that we'll let our images be used copyright free. But it's been really important to the organization of the initiative, because we still clear every image. But if we had to pay really expensive permission fees, writer fees, I don't know if the initiative would have got off the ground. It did get off the ground, as Shelley mentioned. I won a fellowship. I was able to use that money. And then what I did from there is I went out and I found a sponsor, just the way a museum development department would for every exhibition that it might do. So for instance, interestingly, this book, it was on an artist named Joyce Whelan, fantastic first woman artist to have an exhibition at the National Gallery of Canada. Some of you may know the name Phyllis Lambert. She founded the Canadian Centre for Architecture, which is a remarkable place in Canada. She was the biggest patron of Joyce Whelan while Joyce Whelan was alive. So I sort of just did a cold call. Hi, we're doing this project. Would you be interested in sponsoring it? And that is really how we have that is much the way our funding model has worked. Now, ACI has had, I want to really stress this, when I started ACI, I was really doing it as an extracurricular activity while I was doing my PhD. I had 3 young kids, a lot going on, but I thought, like, why not give this a try? Like, just, so I didn't have any great plan of starting a national institution that it has now become, but this is what really helped ACI. 2012, 33% of Canadians were using smartphones. The year that we founded, that number rose to 56% of Canadians, right? And now we are at 91% of Canadians use smartphones. That is the number one place where people are going for their information, right? So that has really explained why this program, the Canadian Online Art Book Project, has really, really exploded. And one of the things that has made it really successful, I'll get into a bit more about the books in a minute, but one of the things that's really made it successful is that now, if somebody is looking for a Canadian artist, they're typing it that name into a search engine. If we have done a book on that artist, it shows up first. And so one of the things I hear often from curators, professors, teachers, is that by having an ACI book on a subject, it almost puts that individual into a canon of Canadian artists. So that was something that I don't know if that was really an intended outcome. I don't think it was, because as I said, I didn't think too much about everything, but that is something that has been really unique about it. What I'm showing you here now is different screenshots of different sections of each of our online art books. One of the things, so we now have some different series within the Canadian Online Art Book Project, but when we began with simply doing a life and work series. So it was Jean-Paul Lemieux, life and work. And what you can see is the different sections of each of the books. There's a biography section, a key work section, a style and technique section, a significance and critical issue section. With these sections, what we did at the Art Canada Institute is we really thought about how do people use online technology? How are they using it to find out about an artist? What we didn't want to do is take a print book and put it online. What we wanted to do was create different sections to understand artists in different ways. In some ways, the key work section of our books is almost parallel to the biography section. And by that, I mean, by looking at the key works of an artist one after the other, the key works are not in an ACI book the greatest hits of an artist. They are works that give the overview of an artist's career to understand it. So somebody might just read the key work section. Somebody might just read the biography section. Somebody might just read the significance and critical issue section. But one thing about the books is that all sections are hyperlinked to each other. Here's an example, a biography page from another book on William Notman. I believe that William Notman is in the Getty collection. He's one of Canada's most esteemed photographers. He came to Canada from Scotland in the early 19th century. And so here you can see this is essentially our table of contents across the top of the book, and then each of the different chapters a drop-down menu. So we have the Glasgow years, Fresh Start in Canada, Business Development, Montreal Art and Society. And this is a more up close look at what the different pages look like. All of ACI books are very heavily illustrated, something that has been very important to us since the start of ACI, is to find visual content that hasn't been published elsewhere. So while authors are writing books that are approximately 25,000 words, one of the other things that we do, and one of the features of the books, is that they have about 100 to 120 images in them. One of the other key features of the books is that you can see we have a pop-up glossary for terms. One of the things that really mattered to us is that we wanted to keep people on the site. We didn't want people going off the site to try to find terms or link to somewhere else off the site. So we have now, over the years, acquired a huge glossary. Here we're into another chapter of the book called Key Works. Again, so when you click on Key Works, you get into this landing page. And again, here what we're looking at is a range of the different types of works, of images that Notman made throughout his career, from sports photography to one of the things that was very popular in Victorian times was photographs of the dead, composite photographs, landscape photographs, etc. And then just to go back for a moment, once you would be, say, on a particular image, click again, and then a more in-depth look. All of the blue that is underlined, that is an area that is hyperlinked to another section of the book. Again, the significance and critical issues, another section that goes more in depth in terms of probing, is photography and art? Who took that picture? Photography as a social encounter. I'm showing you this because, as I mentioned, everything that we do in French and English simultaneously. So sometimes I actually think with every book that we do, it's as though we're publishing 6 books at once rather than one book, because of the different formats and then the French language. Here, another section, style and technique. Again, to get at what really is the technical component behind the art making. Again, here is a close-up look of a screen grab of a style and technique section. Sources and resources. This is also something that's been really important for scholarship, is being able to provide writings on a very robust bibliography that includes both text-based references as well as digital and audio. And finally, a really important component of our books has been the Where to See section, which would take people to different places where the artist's works are kept. And that was something that has also allowed ACI to have a very strong partnership with museums, not just across Canada, but also around the world, because one of the things that we are doing with what we've created is that we are driving traffic to museums around the world. And as we all know, museum attendance is down post-COVID. We have to be thinking about how to do things in a different way. And something that's really significant is that we here at the Art Canada Institute all the time, that people will see a work online, and then that will be an incentive to go and see the work, much in the same way that we do everything in our lives now, from deciding on a restaurant to go to or a bike to buy. We're going to look online first, and then we're going to go and see it. Another component of what we've been doing with the Art Canada Institute is we give a lot of promotion to our authors who write the books. And that has been something that has also been part of the reason that the organization has grown, is that I'll tell you, for instance, with Sarah Parsons, who is really one of the very first ACI authors, definitely she took a bit of a flyer and leap of faith in working with us, because I couldn't say to her, look at this other model, this is what we've done. I just said, you know, if you want to do this book, I'll try to make it really good, and hopefully it will be. But the thing was, it was. And even 10 years ago, there were a lot of people trying to figure out how to make content look good online. And it's kind of easier said than done. And so what we have been able to provide for our authors is we peer review all of everything that we publish. We actually do 2 peer reviews. We, in addition to having authors do their writing, we will work with trade book editors to ensure that the language is easily accessible. And then, as I mentioned before, another thing that we do for our authors is we clear all permissions, we do all design, etc. And so that has resulted in, now we have our publishing program. It is totally booked for 3 seasons out. And we have a very, very long list of people who want to work with us. People often say to me, how do you make the decisions for AC? This, by the way, is a list of many of the names who are part of the ACI content creator community. And people often say to me, so how do you decide on the books that you do? And I always say, I am not the decider. I very intentionally am not. We have an editorial advisory council that if somebody wants to write an ACI book, they first of all have to write a proposal. That proposal is peer reviewed. We're really, really quite strict now about what we take on, mainly because it's a lot of work to publish the way we publish. Our standards are really, really high. And if we are going to invest in somebody, we need to know that they are going to be working just as hard. But it's worked out really well. And so from there, I'll tell you a little bit about how ACI has grown. So we had our flagship program was our publishing program. And then from there, starting in 2020, we quickly grew a lot. And it's not a coincidence that it coincided with COVID, because during COVID, we had an extraordinary amount of traffic. We started a weekly newsletter. I have to confess, I started it less for an educational purpose and more to thinking about, are our donors going to remember us? What can I do to keep we couldn't have any public events. But what ended up happening was the growth of other programs, and because largely out of audience demand. And the first one came in the format of teacher education guides. And so what happened was a lot of kindergarten to grade 12 teachers started contacting the Art Canada Institute and saying, we love these books that you're doing, but as a teacher, it's too hard for me to distill it and make it available for my students. Like, I just don't have time to create lesson plans, etc. Would you guys ever consider doing it? And we thought about it and thought, actually, that would be really great, because it is feeds right out of our book publishing program. And it allowed us to do something that was really needed in the country. There is no pan-Canadian education program other than the Art Canada Institute program. The program, in a nutshell, runs like this: that we worked with a group of curriculum experts across the country to find out what were key topics that were being taught from, again, kindergarten to grade 12. So topics like business, topics like environmentalism. And what we then did with our guides is that we looked at art as a doorway or a window to understanding art. So in other words, learn about clear cutting through the art of Emily Carr, learn about entrepreneurial and business through the art of William Notman. And what that meant was that if an educator didn't know who the artist was, they still knew they had to teach a unit on art and activism. And so that they would go to the general idea resource guide and use it, or they had to teach a unit on Canadian identity. Didn't matter if they didn't know who Greg Kerno was, the guide served them really well. Ditto teaching on women in the Second World War. That was a way for them to discover who Molly Lamb Boback was. Astronomy, one of the greatest ways to learn about it is through the art of Patterson Ewan. A wonderful Canadian artist who's focused so much on multiculturalism was William Karelic. We did a teacher resource guide on him. In the 1950s, there was an artist named Paul-Émile Bourdois, who wrote one of Canada's most important manifestos called Refuge Global. We did a teacher guide on politics and change through the art of Paul-Émile Bourdois. A brief look inside the guides. We always provide teachers with one page on who the artist is, a timeline on the artist in the context of his or her life, and then as well, teaching activities that teachers could use. And so all of this content, it's available on our website, free of charge, in both French and English. And so this has really made it now in some ways is even bigger than our flagship publishing program. Teachers use it all the time. And one of the things that we have learned is that they really will mix and match. Very few teachers will work through an entire teacher resource guide. Some do, but they'll look for one particular learning activity. And one of the other things that we always provide in the teacher guides is a one-pager, make art in the style of this artist, and as well as something on additional resources. This here is another pillar of what ACI does. If any of you are super interested in Canadian art, sign up for our Friday newsletter. So what you're looking at here are 4 different newsletters that I just put on a slide side by side. And what we decided to do is that every Friday, these newsletters are almost like a mini exhibition. Sometimes it is tying into a moment in current events, the war in Ukraine. Sometimes it's more whimsical, like tying it to April Fool's Day, the art of illusion. Sometimes more newsy, like what's going on at the Venice Biennale. But one of the things with these newsletters is that wherever we can, and as often as we can, we draw attention to our online art book library. And so that is something else that has really, really fueled the growth of what we've been doing and fueled our brand. So something else that's really interesting happened in 2020 in the history of the Canadian Online Art Book Project. And that, of course, was the death of George Floyd. And after that took place, the Art Canada Institute received a lot of email asking us, can you talk to us about who the most important Black artists are in Canadian art history? And I looked around with my colleagues, one of them who is Black, who had done an MA on Black artists in Canada. And one of the things that we became apparent really, really fast is we could name a lot of contemporary artists, but we couldn't name historical artists. Another thing that people contacted us and asked about, tell us about Asian artists in Canadian art history. Again, we could talk a lot about contemporary artists, very, very little about artists in Canadian art history. I then began talking to a lot of museum curators, directors of graduate studies, asking them about, where were the figures who were Black, Indigenous, people of color in Canadian art history. Again, not contemporary art. And people really just said this is something that hasn't been overlooked. That has been overlooked. I mean, I think we can all remember that most of us, when Griselda Pollock wrote her book about why have there been no great women artists. So we've just been dealing with that so recently. We started asking ourselves at the Art Canada Institute, what about artists who were working with materials that weren't considered museum quality materials? What about artists who were excluded from museums because of race, color, gender, sexual identity? And so we launched this initiative called the Redefining Canadian Art History Fellowship Program, with the idea of the canon that we were creating, that we had to change that canon for the 21st century. So it was a really big shift in thinking about what we were doing. And so now what we do, our first cohort was in 2022. This is our cohort for 2023. What we do is we offer 4 to 5 scholars who are emerging scholars, $30,000 a year, $30,000 or rather for 1 year, to write about a topic that has been overlooked in Canadian art history because the categories of art history just excluded these artists. So here you see who are 2023 recipients and the projects that they're working on. And so what will happen is that their scholarship will become a part of the online art book project library. So we are essentially changing the canon, so to speak. A little bit more about the ACI. We do public events. We're actually just sort of starting to ease into it now in the post-pandemic years. I did want to mention that even though I thought we will never do print books, like I really don't ever want to do it, we somehow ended up, we do some print books. And I will tell you, people ask me, so how do you decide what becomes a print book? The reason is almost exclusively based on a sponsor who says, I really believe in what the Art Canada Institute's doing, the democratization of art and knowledge, etc. But I really love a print book, and I'm willing to support it financially. I will tell you that for the print books that you see on screen here, the that are available through purchase on Amazon or bookstores, etc., we're able to sell like 800 to 1,000, whereas our downloads are anywhere between 10,000 to 60,000. Like there is no comparison. And it's funny because sometimes people, depending on where you are on the age spectrum, some people will say, oh, it's not real unless it's a print book. If you're talking to my students, they will say it is not real unless it is a digital book. Here's another image. Now I wanted to show you this one because look at the image, the Helen McNicoll book. Helen McNicoll was somebody who was a Canadian Impressionist. She went to France, had a very successful career in France, and then voila, ended up this past summer at the Art Gallery of Ontario. There was an exhibition on her and Mary Cassatt because they painted at exactly the same time. And and so I go back to this image, sort of like where I started. It looks a bit kind of empty for this opening, etc. But when you go and you type Helen McNicoll into a search engine, this is what you see come up. And right at the top is the Art Canada Institute book, which we had actually done probably 3 or 4 years before the exhibition was created, and what I am trying to say here is not that the exhibition is not completely worthwhile. My point is simply this, is that it was doing our online art book that gave Helen McNicoll kind of a new notoriety. She wasn't that known in Canada, that then led a curator at the AGO to say, oh, this is a really incredible artist. And I compare her work with Mary Cassatt because they were painting at the same time, and create an exhibition. So a lot of our work is also fueling exhibition programming. Just a quick audience comparison of the growth rate of our followers over a period of time between January and March of 2023. We are a tiny organization compared to the Art Gallery of Ontario, the National Gallery of Canada. Our budget is 2.5 million. Their budgets are about 75 million. We are so punching above our weight in terms of what we're doing. It might be because they are not that engaged in the digital, right? It is most likely that. I think if they really gave it a try, we might have more competition. But I show you this to show you that when it comes to online publishing, my experience is really that in Canadian museums, it has not yet been embraced. And it is, and in fact, there are very few places in Canadian museums where producing really strong content for an online audience has become a priority. At best, there are some organizations that have digitized part of their collections, but really there hasn't been an institution that has thought about how can I make that information meaningful and useful to a large public audience. And so that is what we are continuing to do. I'm going to stop here because I want to be able to answer any questions that you have, but that is sort of gives you a snapshot of what we've been up to in the last 10 years. I will also say from a staffing point of view, we went from being a, staffing of 1 volunteer, myself, to now a staff of 12 that work with us, doing everything from translation to editing to design to marketing to running our fellowship program. And for me, I started a PhD thinking that I would either go work at a museum or go teach. And as it turns out, I really feel like what the Art Canada Institute is doing is something that is much more needed. Museums, I don't think they cannot exist the way that they existed in the 18th century. And so I feel like what the Art Canada Institute is doing is a service for museums, a service for scholars, a service for people who have a general interest in art. And that is the brief history of the Art Canada Institute.
Thank you so much. And that was a fascinating story. Maybe if you stop sharing your screen, we can see if people have hands raised, or feel free to just unmute and ask Sarah a question if you have.
I'll jump in with a question. Sarah, thanks so much for that presentation. It was great to see how far it's come since over the last 10 years. I have a lot of questions, but I guess I want to dive in first to the sort of authorship around the book program. I thought it was really fascinating when you were talking about how the books were structured to kind of answer the questions readers were looking for online. The sort of like you have the biography of the key works, et cetera. And I'm wondering what the experience has been like for authors coming in. Are they happy with that sort of like predetermined structure of the book? Any of them want to like expand on it? Do they expand on it? Do you find people, how is that, and how is that structure, played out over time? If you can just talk a little bit more about that sort of authorship role in that space, that'd be great.
For sure. Thank you, Greg. I think, surprisingly, that it has worked really, really well. And I sort of think about it this way, that whenever you give parameters to do something, say it's like a page, for a coloring book or something like that, like the parameters are there, but authors have figured out a lot of different ways to make it theirs despite the parameters. So, for instance, we've had authors who have said, this has particularly happened around Indigenous titles. Can I write in the first person? And normally we wouldn't do that, but we sort of said, sure, why not? In one instance, it was because the author had a relationship with the artist that he was writing on. It was somebody named Gerald McMaster writing on a Haida carver named Bill Reed. And he said, it just culturally, for me, that's the right thing to do. I have to talk about how it was an evolution also in my career. So I do feel like that structure, that the authors are quite content with it, and people find ways to make it their own.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
Others? Do I see any hands raised?
Hey,
Oh, Greg.
oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I'll jump in for Greg. I'm wondering a little bit about, especially when you were first starting off, how you made the decisions you made about your platform and how that kind of came to be and what your maybe top goals were for an online, for a digital publishing platform, and kind of how those came to be.
Yeah, another excellent question. And it's something that I think about a lot now because of the growth of ACI. When we started, the goals were really just to honestly make it happen. I wasn't thinking about things like audience, like search engine optimization. My area of expertise is in graphic design. It is not in anything to do with coding and anything to do with web build. So in that area, I have been fortunate. I could go on and tell some really funny stories. Like the first the first web builder that we used, I remember thinking there is no way that I can ever work with these people again. They're so rude, so not on time, so completely, not my cup of tea. And then I actually, after we launched, I was we're using somebody else, and then ended up going. And then I actually had a very good friend who runs an IT department for a large company. And he said, I remember he sat me down and he said, you know what, Sarah, you need to change your attitude. It's not you. Forget about the way that you're used to working. Your developers are really good, and go back to them. So I did, and I've actually been working with them for 10 years. But I would say it wasn't things I didn't think about at the beginning. I didn't think about search engine optimization. I really thought that people were going to go, I want a book on Helen McNichol. Go to our website through the front door and find us and look at it. Almost all our traffic right now is through search engine traffic, where people are looking for, things like, I showed you actually that book, Joyce Wieland. We had a librarian from Texas contact us. The librarian was searching the terms women, experimental film, 1960s, ended up in the middle of the Joyce Wieland book. And that for me has actually been the most rewarding component of starting ACI. Similar thing happened. I had a professor in Spain write me, say he was searching terms like realism, 1960s Maritimes or something like that, came across a Canadian artist, one of the greatest Canadian artists named Alex Colville, and wrote and said, thank you so much. I have now introduced Alex Colville's painting to our class. Now, all this is to answer your question by saying, at the beginning, we were really the only goal that I had was to make it happen and to be able to show the people, the first sponsors, we did it. This lives, it exists, etc. Now I'm much more interested. Now we do have a marketing department, and so they are advertising, and they are, you know, and we're on different social media platforms to draw a larger audience. Right now, we have more of a concentrated audience in Canada around Quebec and Ontario. I don't really understand why that is, but we really want to, you know, have an audience that draws from the entire country. So I would say that that our decisions are shifting constantly in terms of what we're thinking about.
Someone asked, what was the question? Oh, how many books went out in the first batch to go online?
In the very first year, the first batch, I actually, in retrospect, think this was like a really good idea that I had, which is that when the site went live, we said these 6 books were coming. So in the first year, 6 books were published, but in the when we launched and we had a big party, there was just 1 book. So and the site was like super sparse. It was like, here are these 6 books, that's it. But what we said is this is our program for the next year. So it didn't look so empty. And then we have really stuck to more or less to doing 6 books a year. We right after the pandemic, like right in March of 2020, we, you know, when everybody thought maybe this is the apocalypse, we thought we should cut it. That year we cut it back to 4. Only because, again, we were sort of concerned, especially as a donor reliant organization. We thought, like, what if we don't have the funds to go forward? But yeah, but we have sort of consistently done 6. We do 50 newsletters a year. We do 8 education guides a year, and then we do our 4 to 5 fellowships. That is sort of the you know, the backbone of what our publishing is and our program is like.
Wow. Mary Huber, you have your hand up? Go ahead.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I have 2 questions. The first is probably more straightforward. I wonder how much effort is put into SRO for these books as opposed to them getting the amount of sort of attention and the placement on the page, simply because, like, A, they're so well designed for the internet and for the digital experience, and B, because often there's not a lot of, you know, good scholarly work that's accessible on these artists. And then my second question is, you've touched sort of briefly on the fact that you publish these books simultaneously in English and French. And I was wondering if you wanted to maybe elaborate a little more on the process of bilingual publishing in light of language justice, because I think this questions, I mean, obviously the needs of a publisher or a museum are going to be different depending on where they are, depending on demographics. So I'm very interested in that aspect of accessibility as well. Thank you.
Okay, so for your first question, we have not even been thinking about anything to do with SRO until like basically the last year. We have sort of been able to, as you astutely pointed out, our success has really in some ways come from being like the only game in town. And it's been like a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, we created good content. It you know, it always ranks on the first page of a search because it's there. A lot of people use it. But where we are now really starting to think differently is for, you know, the reason that I mentioned, which I don't totally understand, that there are certain areas, geographic areas, where our following is much more intense, and in some ways it should be broader. So that's where we're trying to shift things up. In terms of your question about language, which is really excellent, especially in light of the fact that over the last 10 years, AI translation software has improved so much. Like one of the things that right now we're addressing is we use traditional translators. We do not use AI translators. So it's actually, from a production point, quite complicated, more expensive. And so, you know, we're sort of talking about, like, I think we've got to maybe switch this up. Although if you talk to a translator about using AI instead, like you might as well cause a revolution. Like, it's like, oh my goodness, why would you even, you know, it's the standards there. It people get really anxious and nervous, but your point is an excellent one, because we actually have figured out a way to publish quite efficiently in French and English. It's sort of hard to do the translation piece, but the publishing part isn't that hard. That if we wanted to, we could do the same thing in 32 different languages, right? And so the reason we're doing it in French and English in Canada is because in Canada, that is really what the market is. But we have thought about things like, for instance, we published last spring. There's a very well-known Canadian artist based in Vancouver. Her name is Jinmi Yoon. She's Korean Canadian. And there was so much interest in her art that a Korean publisher ended up financing a print edition of the online book that we did, but then also has asked us if we can do an online version in Korean. And the reality is, like, yes, we can. It's in many ways, I will tell you, the things that are limiting ACI right now is not a desire to do things or a belief that things that should be done. It's that when we started, we didn't realize, like, that there was going to be such a need, interest, desire in what we are doing. And so yeah, I've ended up being much busier than I ever intended. And but I think your point is an excellent one. Like, I do think, you know, ideally we should be publishing in a number of different languages, and I suspect we will likely get there. And at least around certain titles, there's a huge, also in Canada, a very, very strong movement to publish in Indigenous languages. So we did a book, for instance, on an artist named Kent Monkman. He's a Cree artist, you know, and there's a desire to publish in Indigenous languages. Anything to do with an Inuit artist, that also very, very strong desire to publish in an Indigenous language. So yes, that is something. But from a publishing point of view, not super hard. Like, the mechanism is there. It's really just like what you would do in a traditional publishing model. Like, you've got to just get the translation and then kind of load it up.
Katie?
Thank you, Sarah. This is fascinating and really inspiring. And I guess I know we're close to time, but I'm wondering, like, sitting here with a bunch of museum people, a lot of museum people on the call, and thinking about, you know, you saw really there was a niche, there was an opportunity, because museums were not doing this. They were not, you know, you talk about punching above your weight, and some of that is, you know, I'm thinking about the luxury in a certain way of starting from scratch, of kind of identifying, like, what it is that is this clearly defined niche, you know, developing an editorial program that allows you to draw upon, you know, the best and the brightest who are interested in writing on those topics, identifying the topics that you want to write about. You know, museum publishers can be more constrained in that we're publishing around a particular collection or a certain program. And also, depending on your institution, you know, you can really be kind of more siloed in terms of, like, we're responsible for this sort of content type, as opposed to, having these kind of thinking about something from this interconnected way of multiple audiences, and which is wonderful. We can do it, but I think it can take more work, especially at bigger institutions, to like build those bridges with colleagues, because the classic museum siloing situation. So I guess I wonder if, for you as somebody who is like, what advice would you give us? What do you think like we as museum publishers could be doing to leverage off of like what you have learned in thinking about the types of content we're publishing online, and where you see we're kind of maybe missing opportunities?
Wow, that's such a good question, and it's so hard because
you have 2 minutes.
No, the reason it's so hard is because I have a lot of colleagues at museums, and now, like, something that happened just this week is one of them at the National Gallery said, would you work with us to be able to publish our content on your platform? That is probably a direction that ACI is going to go in, is that in a way, to use Netflix, I'm not really answering your question, I apologize, but I'm trying to. In the way that Netflix, when it started, was only streaming other people's content, and then they started creating Netflix originals, we've only been creating ACI originals. And now we will most likely start adapting content from museums that's either out of print or not out of print, because the National Gallery contacted us and they said, we're spending $150,000 on a publication. We're only selling it in our gift shop. We end up putting the copies into a warehouse. What if we were to be able to put some of that content on your platform? And the thing is, for us, we are institutionally agnostic. We exist really just to get people into the door of Canadian art and art history, to democratize the subject. So, I mean, I don't know. Like, I would say, in terms of what you could do as a museum professional, I think from what my colleagues at museums tell me, they're like, it is so hard and bureaucratic. Even when ACI started, I remember asking the very first museum director that I talked to, I said, well, I don't want to do this if you're going to do this. And then what he did is he was like, oh, I'm going to show you this list of my meeting that I'm going to next. These are the subjects we're covering, like ground security, like copyright question, like so many. He's like, we are never going to be able to get there. You have the nimbleness and flexibility to be able to do it. So I do. And I also think in museum collections, their priority is to display art, right? It's not to create a research and publishing program. So all this is a roundabout way of saying that I do think there are other organizations, sort of like the ACI, not exactly, but sort of emerging, that might have more flexibility. And it maybe is like almost like a third party model where to work with, with somebody else who does have the flexibility of doing it, because it is so hard within a museum that has like a publishing program that has to coexist with an exhibition program that has to coexist with, like a lot of legacy baggage, which we have never, even the idea that we decided we are going to ask for people to not charge us copyright fees, right? Like, that is something that it would be really hard for any museum to do that in Canada, because it would run up against something called CARFAC laws, which essentially mean not paying an artist, right? Which you don't really want to, you want to obviously compensate an artist. But what we thought about doing was we would say to the artist or the artist estate, we know we can't pay you, but we're going to do something way better for you, which is that we're going to make your art known on an international platform. So anyway, all that is to say, I don't know, the museum, unless museums, it constantly amazes me that museums are not thinking about developing a more robust open source platform that will actually draw people into their collections. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know whether it's talking to the marketing department and making people understand nobody is doing anything in our world without looking at it online first, and that will draw people into museums, or whether it's just a total workaround and work, you know, with a like a different platform and make it available that way. I don't know if that's the answer, but it's like perhaps
If it
one
were
of the
easy, it
hardest
would be
questions.
solved, you know.
Yeah, I think that's
Thank you.
perhaps one of the hardest questions I've ever had.
What a wonderful way to end. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to Sarah. That was fascinating. And just a reminder, I've posted the link for the mailing list where you can find these saved onto YouTube and how to email us. And the next one will be again December 12th at noon. And if you have any ideas for presenters or projects, again, reach out to the steering committee because we're always looking for great content.